I, Bergeron, am responsible for the present constitution of the firm of Burden and Bergeron. I am responsible for the professional existence, almost for the existence at all, of Burden. I deliberately called him forth from his obscurity, summoned him, as it were, from the realm of the mothers, and set him up in space and time. It is not the fault of either of us that we have since become involved in a complex of responsibilities from which there may be no way out until the shadows lengthen, the busy world is hushed, and our work is done. It may not be the fault of either of us. It certainly is not his, that he is turning into a sort of Frankenstein. But in all my present bewilderment, I am at least certain of this, that if without injuring anyone but him, I can do anything to arrest the process and keep my own end up, I ought to do it. So I am trying to keep his diary and see what happens. This is my Declaration of Independence. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Inklings Review. That passage is from the first pages of this ever-diverse pair by Owen Barfield. Now, Barfield might be a writer you're not very familiar with. He is certainly one of the more obscure Inklings, but he's also one of the 4 major fiction writers within the group. His successes, however, in a lot of cases became early in his career or became late in his career. And he's incredibly influential on the entire group. His early successes academically with the history of English words and poetic diction influenced the way that both C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien thought about language. And those works also influenced ideas that he would eventually develop into his idea that he would call an evolution of consciousness. Now, the other major success, though, was a small children's novel fantasy called The Silver Trumpet. And this really became a test case success for what Tolkien and Lewis would later do with The Hobbit and Narnia. The problem, however, for Barfield that led him to this, I think, unjust obscurity is the fact that these successes weren't successful enough. And after an attempt to publish a large novel called English People in 1929, Barfield, with a few lingering exceptions, largely gave up on a literary life. Now, he still participated in the Inklings, coming several times a year to Oxford and joining in the Inkling meetings that happened in Lewis's rooms and down at the pub. In fact, Barfield was sometimes thought of as kind of the Lewis whisperer, because he could handle Lewis in a way when he was getting particularly a little too much Jack for the conversation of the night. But during this time when he saw Lewis and Tolkien being successful and his other friends being academically successful, and yet he had to abandon all of this to support his family and had joined his father's solicitor's office. And while this certainly paid the bills, it didn't nourish his soul. And by the late 40s, he was starting to show the signs of depression, and he himself admits that he felt like he was headed toward a nervous breakdown. And rather than plunge headlong into that darkness, he picked up his pen one more time and wrote this fine novel called This Ever-Diverse Pair. Now, this book is humorous, serious, and sometimes simple, sometimes complex. But ultimately, this is what allowed Barfield to continue to be Barfield, and about a decade later, embark on a late-in-life academic career, largely in the United States. So, this is what we're going to be talking about today. So, make sure you hit like and subscribe, because I forgot to say that already. Make sure you hit like and subscribe, and let's talk more about This Ever-Diverse Pair by Owen Barfield. So what is the story of this ever-diverse pair? What was this summoning someone else into space and time? Well, it's the story of 2 solicitors, Bergen and Burden, who work in the same law firm. Except one problem. They're not really 2 different people. They're the same person, but two personalities. Burden is the lawyer who is diligent in his work, but also willing to stretch the meaning of words beyond to the point where sometimes words have no meaning. Whereas Burden is definitely the part of Barfield that Barfield really wants to be, the poetic soul. And these two personalities both work well together, but also work in opposition to each other in a lot of ways. But it's a very episodic book. But unlike The Hobbit, which we talked about last month, where each episode was advancing the group further eastward from Bilbo's home to the Lonely Mountain, this is all much more random. Separate episodes that reveal character and the tension between our two characters, but not a single plot happening. So obviously I'm not going to sit here and break down every single episode as a way of summarizing the story, but I do want to mention two. One is early on. It shows Barfield's very clever and also somewhat dry wit, where two law firms, Burden representing one client, and against another law firm, two business partners who have completely had their relationship disintegrate. And they are arguing over who actually should get what paperwork, and the letters being exchanged between the two law firms start off very cordial and hilariously get snarkier and snarkier and start to insult each other over the course of the chapter. And the letters go from being a few paragraphs long to being basically a couple sentences at the end. And it's a great example of Barfield's wit and showing how the two sides of Burden and Burden work together. The other chapter that's particularly of note is one in which C.S. Lewis makes an appearance. Now, Barfield and Lewis had known each other going back to their undergrad days at Oxford. And part of Barfield's depression was somewhat jealousy of the success that Lewis and others in the group had had. But at the same time, Lewis and him were still friends. And more importantly, Barfield was Lewis's solicitor. And when Lewis became successful financially with the Narnia books, he almost got himself into a lot of trouble with the tax organization in Britain, because he was giving away his money to charity so fast that he was basically in danger of owing taxes without having any money. And this amusing story is retold with Lewis being given the name Ramsden, purposely echoing his character from the space trilogy, Ransom, and the how Lewis was this jovial person who didn't care, who was incredibly smart, but didn't care at all about the legal matters. And it's how Burden and Burden are able to have the poetic soul interact with the Lewis character, but the Burden character, the legal soul, they work in tandem with each other to save Lewis. And Lewis is obviously thankful, but also doesn't care anything about the details. Now, as the story goes forward through each of these episodes, you see tensions between the poetic soul and the legal mind. And particularly, as someone for Barfield who words have meaning and give meaning to life, the fact that this legal mind keeps chipping away at the importance of language and the meaning of language eventually comes to a head toward the end of the book. And then finally, in two dreams, back-to-back dreams at the end of the novel, the two sides are finally able to find some sort of reconciliation. And essentially, it's Barfield working his way mentally out of his near nervous breakdown. All right, now what are the weaknesses of the book? Now, Barfield there are two writers in the group I think I always like to compare, and that's Barfield and Charles Williams. Charles Williams has some of the most complex prose with some of the simplest ideas, which we'll of course talk more about when we start talking about Williams literature. But Barfield is kind of the opposite. His ideas in a lot of ways are the most complex, but his prose is pretty simple. And you see that throughout this book, especially the simple, clean prose allows for his humor to shine through, 4/5 of the book. That last fifth of the book, though, is the two last chapters of the dreams, and that's where you really have to focus and try and figure out what he's saying. This idea of polarity between the two sides and how you reconcile those are not the easiest ideas to understand. And so you can kind of cruise along through most of the book just enjoying the anecdotes happening, but you really do have to focus at the end of the book. And I would really say that is the biggest weakness in the book. But even with that, I don't think that overlap it doesn't blot out any of the good things about the book. The biggest strength, I think, is maybe not even about the book itself, is the fact that Barfield wrote it at all. Barfield had several books and narrative poems that were declined through the 1930s and 1940s. But this gave him a boost of confidence and allowed him to continue writing, even if immediately after the book he still found some other rejections coming his way. But his literary career that happens in the 1960s and 70s until his death in the 1990s really doesn't happen without this book. Now, the other thing, though, is not just what it did for him, it's what it can do for us who read it. If you are a writer or any kind of artistic person who really struggles with how do you put together a life that is meeting the needs of life, having to pay the bills, making sure food's on the table, making sure rent's paid, and yet you still get to express that poetic nature within you, it is a book that's going to speak to you. It certainly did for me at a particular time in my life when I first read it, the initial time. And so if you are in any type of way feeling that push and pull in life, this is a book that speaks to that, and it does it so clearly. That is one of the absolute strengths of the book, that Barfield allowed his experiences to become somewhat universal in the reading. So now it's time we got to rank the book. How do I rank it? Well, I think unlike The Hobbit, where the weaknesses are coming from other people, I understand the weakness of the end of the book. Lewis also felt that it was a little deus ex machina, that Barfield just simply thought his way through his problem. I think the complexity of the idea that he's trying to express in those last two chapters can intimidate people. So I'm going to give this a 4.5 out of 5 stars rather than the full 5 out of 5 that I gave The Hobbit. But it is an absolutely wonderful book. Again, if you are someone who does struggle with the artistic life, with the life that we kind of are forced into living to make ends meet, this is a book you absolutely have to read, so highly recommend it. I also want to make a quick note, because this will not be the only time we talk about Owen Barfield, and a lot of the work I've gotten to encounters, work I've done with Owen Barfield over the years, has also not just some of the sources I'm going to put in there, but I've also shared emails with the Barfield Estate at times, and so I also want to give some credit to Owen Barfield's grandson, whose name is also Owen Barfield, for also helping keep my interest in Owen Barfield going all these years. And so, please, Owen Barfield is someone who's in an obscure literary position. but you really should check out more of his work. But definitely start here with this Ever Diverse pair. All right. Next month, we'll be diving into C.S. Lewis for the first time. We're going to be looking at probably his most famous book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So join us next month on the Inklings Review. Join us every week here on the channel as we have new videos every Sunday. And I will see y'all next time. Y'all have a wonderful day.